The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author and journalist Thomas Frank on centrist Democrats and the rise of Trumpism. Melody Fields Figueredo, executive director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, on why progressive ballot measures win. And Bill Press with Jared Bernstein on what it will take to tackle income inequality. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Progressive historian Thomas Frank says a shift to democratic centrism paved the way for Trump's presidency. And to defeat Trumpism now, Democrats need to get back to being a party that takes a stand for working people. And we say hello to historian and journalist Thomas Frank, author of multiple books, including Listen Liberal, Pity the Billionaire, The Wrecking Crew, and What's the Matter with Kansas. His most recent book is The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. Thomas Frank, as always, nice to have you with us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Jim, it is great to be here on this beautiful sunny day in Bethesda, Maryland.
Absolutely. In the wake of the announcement of Biden's win, you wrote a piece for The Guardian that I will call recommended reading for all our listeners. It's titled, Ding Dong, the Jerk is Gone, but read this before you sing the Hallelujah chorus. In that piece, you ask us to remember how we got to Trump in the first place, and a lot of people don't realize this. Take us back to the 80s. What happened to the Democratic Party that began to lay the groundwork for a Trump presidency?
It actually goes back a little further than the 80s, but just because I don't want to get into the weeds here, let's start then. And this is a period when the Democratic Party was, there was all of this infighting going on, different factions in the Democratic Party going at it with one another. And basically all these different reform factions were saying the same thing, which is that the Democratic Party has to move away from the New Deal. They can no longer be the party of Franklin Roosevelt. They can no longer be the party of the New Deal. This is people at the time documented this. It went on and on. And I mean, Rahm Emanuel was still beating this drum just a few years ago. He wrote a book where he was still making this argument that the Democratic Party has to no longer think of itself as the party of Roosevelt, the party of the New Deal. They have to be a different party now. And what all of this basically meant, it was shorthand for, was that the Democrats had to say goodbye to working class organizations, by which we mean, labor, organized labor. And that was really the story of the Democratic Party in the 70s and in the 80s. And it led to sort of failure after failure after failure. And then all of a sudden in 1992, they had success with this strategy. This is Bill Clinton's presidency. Clinton came out of a group called the Democratic Leadership Council. And their entire mission in life was to shift the Democratic Party to the right, to sort of accept the Reagan Revolution. To say, basically that the Democrats were now a kind of junior. How would you put it? They were basically the same as the Republicans, except for that they had a social conscience. That they were better on sort of culture war issues. And the Democratic Leadership Council was remarkable for a lot of reasons. All of the principals have written their memoirs talking about what a great success the Democratic Leadership Council was. But the part of it that really gets me is that their justification for shifting the Democrats to the right would change all the time. They could never settle on why they were doing this, just that they wanted to do it. And it was always sold as like, this is the practical thing to do. This is the way you win elections. And back then it was because the idea was you had to move to the right in order to win Southern states, and the Democrats could never win again unless they had Southern states. And then later on, it became that the Democrats had to do this to get in step with the new economy, the sort of post-industrial techno economy. And that's sort of that's the sort of justification that survives and that we hear all the time today. But basically, the Democratic Party did change. This is not like, it was not just some superficial thing. They really did, to the point where today, you look at the fundraising totals, you look at where the parties are at. Joe Biden, and before him, Hillary Clinton, and before her, Barack Obama, these people are really the favorite of Wall Street, and especially of Silicon Valley, and of the sort of the elites in American society. The Democratic Party has achieved what they set out to do in the 70s and 80s. They've gone from being a party of working people to being a party of these kind of post-industrial elites. That really has happened. And what we, you can feel good about this, or you can feel bad about it, but what people never talk about, and what we need to come to grips with, is that this paved the way for Trumpism. Mm-hmm. This made possible the kind of mass delusion of Trump supporters that they are going up against this great, powerful elite, and that the Republican Party now, is the party of America's workers, which is just a delusion, but a powerful, I shouldn't say delusion, a powerful sort of dream, and that's what makes it. This is what makes Trumpism seem real.
Right. Before we move to today, I want to go back to the 90s. You mentioned Bill Clinton, 92, really solidifies this shift to centrism. Talk about the political consequences of some of the specific decisions that were made at that point.
Oh my God. So the Clinton administration was, it was basically, say what you want about Bill Clinton. If you look at it objectively, Clinton secured the legacy of Reaganism. Clinton got all of these, Reagan was the great revolutionary figure in our time who really changed the narrative and the way politics were heading. But Reagan, a lot of the Reagan agenda, Reagan couldn't get it done. Congress was still constantly, back then, was always controlled by Democrats because they were the party of the New Deal, and et cetera. But here comes Bill Clinton, and he was able to get a whole lot of the Reagan agenda done. For example, NAFTA. This was a Republican initiative. Republicans negotiated it. Reagan and George Bush Sr. negotiated this, but they couldn't get it through Congress. Clinton did because he was a Democrat. Welfare reform. This was another case where the Reagan people wanted to go after, they wanted to go after welfare from day one, but they remember Reagan would talk about the welfare queens and all of these welfare frauds and all that sort of thing. They couldn't do it, but Clinton did. Clinton was able to get that done. And you go down the list of the deregulation of banks, which Clinton achieved. Reagan deregulated banks a lot, but Clinton went much further. Or the mass incarceration. Of course, Reagan started that began under Nixon, but Clinton took it to a kind of maximum, this sort of maximum end game with the crime bill of 1994. These are all of those four things that I just mentioned. NAFTA, bank deregulation, the crime bill, and welfare reform. These are Clinton's great achievements. If you read any non-crazy history of the Clinton era, these are his four great achievements. Usually they throw in a fifth, which is he achieved a balanced budget. All five of those things are basically Republican ideals. These are all the ideals of Reaganism. These are not traditional, New Deal kind of democratic, initiatives. These are Republican initiatives, and he got them done.
So he was a Southern son, right? And they were desperate to bring in that Southern vote. I mean, how much does that play a role?
The funny thing is that it didn't really matter. The Democrat, I mean, Bill Clinton got elected in 92 and then he got reelected in 96. And these are regarded as great triumphs. But the South is still, the South is still all except for Georgia, as we just saw, is still lost to the Democratic Party. And by the way, you got to remember, they weren't just talking about the South. They were talking about the white South specifically. The Democratic Leadership Council was all of these white Southern governors, people like Al Gore, people like Zell Miller. There were all of these white Southern politicians, very conservative Democrats, who were feeling left behind, and that the Democratic Leadership Council was going to be their vehicle. Well, those people are all gone over to not Al Gore, of course, but Zell Miller certainly, and a lot of those other white Southern politicians, they became Republicans. There's no going back. They didn't win Georgia because these conservative Southerners came over to the Democrats. They won Georgia because of this kind of heroic effort, to organize among Black voters there. It's totally different than what the DLC had in mind.
Even with Biden's win, do you still see signs that the Democrats' centrist tilt is at their own political expense?
I do, but I'm the only one that sees that. You're going to hear over the next couple of months, well, you're already hearing it, basically triumphalism from the centrist faction in the Democratic Party. They just won. They won. I mean, do you remember the primaries? How many Democrats were running? We chose the most conservative Democrat on that stage, and he just won. And so it will be, of course, they will depict this as a triumph for their faction. And the woman that he chose as his VP, Kamala Harris, is, was like a close runner-up in the, the most conservative Democrat on the stage. No, I take that back. Bloomberg was probably the second. I'm sorry. Every time I think about that guy, I think about Elizabeth Warren, just like, oh my God, beating him over the head with a 2x4.
I actually forgot that he was on that stage for a short time.
Yeah, that's right. Only one debate, right? Or was it two? He didn't last long.
It wasn't long. His money played a role afterwards, but
yeah. Well, they wanted that. They wanted a piece of that action, but so you're going to hear a lot of triumphalism from the centrist faction in the Democratic Party. But what I'm here to tell you is that by what they have done over the last 30 years, and this continues on with Barack Obama, abandoning the working class as a working class. They still get a lot of working class votes, especially like Black working people, Latino working people, etc. But the working class organizations, the working class as a unity, they have turned their backs on that. They still get a lot of votes from union members too. But by and large, they're not interested in that agenda any longer. They're interested in, look who Biden is already bringing into his, into his organization. It's all these people from Silicon Valley, which is where Obama left off when he was president. In the last 2 years of his presidency, the White House was filled with people from Silicon Valley, and now they're coming right back. And you'll see a lot of people from Wall Street, and it will be the same as ever, glazed over with this triumphalism, and it will stoke the flames of Trumpism even higher, of this kind of phony populism that you see on the right. That is not going to go away anytime soon.
We're speaking with historian and journalist Thomas Frank. His latest book, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. You actually just answered my next question, but I'll throw it out to you anyway, because I want to mention something else that you wrote back in June, because we're on the cusp of the Biden presidency. We don't know how it's going to go, where he's going to go with it. And what you wrote back in June in The Guardian, and you said this, quote, "He stands on behalf of no great causes, just to return to the consensus days of yore." Pretty much sounds like you still feel that way, and that's still your view on him moving forward.
Yeah, I don't see. I mean, I don't see anybody saying. I mean, he is about normalcy. It's kind of one of those sort of funny little historical ironies that he was elected exactly 100 years after Warren G. Harding, whose famous, like, really mangled way of speaking. The word on his speech, as it was written out, as it was typed out, was normality, return to normality. But he read it as normalcy because he was kind of that way. And Biden, and that's exactly where we are. Biden is basically promising that. Now, unfortunately for Biden, the defeated party in this election is not going away anytime soon. In fact, as we see right now, they are engaged in this sort of effort to delegitimize his election, with a view towards undermining his presidency, which they did, of course, to Obama and which they did to Clinton as well. The funny thing about Bill Clinton, to get back to him for a second, all of his compromises, he developed his own word for it. He called them triangulations, where he would sell out his own party's principle to sort of join hands with the Republicans. It actually had more than one term for it. But he thought these were acts of genius. That did not stop the Republicans from moving right. In fact, it encouraged them, as we know from Tom DeLay's memoirs. DeLay said, Clinton would always come halfway to our position, so we would just keep moving our position to the right. It was obvious, and so he had to keep coming our way, and they always get played. So it doesn't stop the advance of the right. It not at all. It's going to take something different. And it's funny, though, you cannot persuade them of this, Jim. They cannot. I've been saying the same thing since What's the Matter with Kansas, which came out in 2004 and was largely a book about the Clinton era. And I've been saying the same thing since that. You cannot persuade anybody of any of this stuff. It's absolutely maddening.
Well, so there is a growing conversation within progressive circles on how to push Biden to the left. We know that pressure will come from progressive members of Congress, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Bernie Sanders. Do you have a sense of whether they can be successful in that effort?
Well, I don't like just being the voice of doom and gloom. So I should say that there are people throwing around a lot of really interesting ideas, people who are close to Biden, who are throwing around a lot of interesting ideas. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on what they are right now.
Well, even you look at something like the Green New Deal, which is,
so
we've been talking about this for
years.
Yeah.
That would be awesome if they were to really double down on that and extend its reach everywhere and make it, obvious to anybody who wants a job can get a job. That's what the original New Deal was. You'll be working in these sort of, in this field rather than that. Well, there was a lot of greenness about the New Deal in the first place. I went to Rocky Mountain National Park this summer. They built all those trails in the national parks. They built all the highways going through the national parks. That was the New Deal. It was pretty damn green. Anyhow, I look forward to something like that. Something like that would be a real winner if they were to put it forward in a really muscular way. I don't see Biden actually doing that. But there are some other ideas that he seems to. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it. But it is very possible that Biden will do. Look, I don't want to be too negative. It's possible Biden will be a great president. It's possible. It's possible he'll be another Franklin Roosevelt. It's possible. It's more likely he'll have a booming economy and it'll look great. This country will look great in 4 years, and the sort of anger of the right will have receded very slightly, like you saw in the late 1990s when the economy was booming, and you did see the right sort of back off very slightly.
Life was good for everybody, right?
Yeah. If you have a kind of booming economy like that. But the thing is that there are these huge parts of America that are like permanently left behind now. And Biden that's where this comes from. Biden has to recognize that. He has to do something about it.
That booming economy, let's point out, also led to the worst recession since the Great Depression. So with all of that,
it was a complete mirage.
Yeah,
they were talking about the .com bubble in the late 90s. It was I used to write about that at the time. It was a complete mirage. It was And then it just, that bubble, once it burst, it fed into the next bubble, which turned out to be the real estate bubble, which then burst, catastrophically.
Yeah, I mean, you've got people that don't make, that make $30,000 to $50,000 a year buying $500,000 homes. That doesn't make any sense.
Eventually, and more importantly, you have an industry that is trying to get them into those houses and will do anything to sell them to them, and then package up the mortgage and sell it to retirees in Dusseldorf or whatever,
Right, and this goes back to that, all of these deregulation things that happened,
under Clinton.
Under Clinton,
that was his great move, and it really hurt us in the end. That's a story that I don't know how many people recognize or understand, but that's look. The thing is that, remember how I was sort of listing for you all the great triumphs of Clintonism. All of those ended in disaster. Every single one of them. The deregulation of Wall Street, disaster. The NAFTA trade agreement, and then worse, PNTR with China. That was one of Clinton's, big moves, right? That was such a big deal. All of those trade agreements, disaster. They led to the, complete collapse of the economy in so many parts of the deindustrialization of huge parts of this country. Welfare reform led to a gigantic spike in extreme poverty in this country. What's his other great triumph? I'm forgetting it. What was Clinton's? So there's three of them. There's a fourth one though. The crime bill. Oh yeah. Well, we know what happened there. Mass incarceration, the militarized police forces. We've seen what happened. I mean, just all of these have just been, have turned to ashes in their mouths. So in some sense, I don't see how Biden can go back. It's not like he can resume doing this stuff. Even Obamacare, which was, Barack Obama has a lot less to boast about than Bill Clinton did, but he did have one great triumph. Which is the Affordable Care Act, which turns out not to have made care affordable at all. Medical bankruptcies are still chugging along. It's healthcare is still an enormous problem in this country.
But it was a great place to start. It was something that, and
it was
Republican efforts to constantly chip away without any sort of plan of their own. I mean, that's just stupid. Let's use that as the model to start with, and maybe rearrange some parts and get some other things going here and there. It just he was heading down the right path.
Yeah, it was compromised from the get-go for unfortunate reasons, because he wanted to keep the insurance industry happy. I think, history will debate this for generations. My own feeling is that Obama was very poorly advised and made really lousy personnel choices when he was designing that, and he wound up with something that was really flawed. And because he tried to keep the private insurance industry in business, tried to keep big pharma profitable, made all of these compromises with them, and wound up with a Band-Aid. As universal health care systems go, it's not great. Now, that's not to say it couldn't be made great. And maybe Biden will do that. I think the public option would be a huge step in making it great. But we'll see what happens. He might have to
make healthcare great again.
No, yeah, exactly. He almost said that the other day in his acceptance speech, or no, his victory speech. But if the Supreme Court strikes the whole thing down, he's going to have to start over from square one, which is going to be, of course, tough because Republicans still have the Senate. The whole thing drives me crazy.
Well, Thomas, I tell you, let's assume Biden does decide to step away from that centrist path. Where should he start?
Oh, well, healthcare is obvious number one thing. Solve that problem. That's going to be real difficult with the Republican Senate. It's going to be difficult with the House the way it is. You've got a whole lot of members of Congress. So look, best case scenario for Biden, let's say he somehow gets a bare majority in the Senate, and then he uses his magical Lyndon Johnson powers to get his agenda through. He does have that he is like Johnson in that sense. He has that ability to persuade senators of almost anything. I'd like to see that happen, but that's obviously the place to begin. Another one I've been thinking about a lot lately, because after healthcare, the pandemic, the largest task confronting him has to be Trumpism. He has to convene, his wise men. And I don't mean a bunch of centrist political scientists. I mean people that actually know what's going on, and talk about Trumpism and what he could do to head this thing off and what he could do to tamp it down. And if you ask me, what you do is like some kind of new deal for these deindustrialized communities, these communities left behind. You rebuild organized labor, you make it easy to form unions again. This has an enormous impact on the way working class people feel about politics when they join a union, when they're part of a collective effort, when they feel that solidarity. And you do things like antitrust. Look, rural America and small town America is in the grip of these incredible monopolies, from Walmart to Amazon to the agricultural monopoly. You break that up. One of the most annoying things that Democrats do nowadays is they look at the sort of left behind. Rahm Emanuel just did this the other day. They look at the people who are left behind and they say, sorry, there's no way to help you. The only way to help you is if you yourself become, brilliant somehow. If you go to college and get a fancy degree or learn to code or something like that, there's no way to. And that's just first of all, that's incredibly bad politics. You just lost those people's vote. Second of all, there are ways to help them. Only an incredibly lazy politician would say there's nothing we can do about 2/3 of this country. I'm sorry, I'm from Kansas City, Missouri, which sits smack in the middle of this zone, right? Where every small town is in ruins, and everybody's in the grip of these big ag monopolies. And to say there's nothing the government can do to help these people it's just profoundly undemocratic and dispiriting. But they always do that. Why do they do that? Because they're lazy. They don't want to have to do anything. They want expectations to be low, et cetera. And they don't believe in it. Rahm Emanuel doesn't like those people. He doesn't care about those people. So, but Joe Biden is a different kind of bird, a different species. I'm sorry. Sometimes my slang is really old fashioned. Joe Biden will, there is a chance he'll rise to the occasion. I would love to see it happen, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
Okay. Historian and journalist Thomas Frank joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. His most recent book, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. Thomas, is always fantastic talking with you today. Love to do it again soon.
Anytime.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the transformative politics of progressive ballot measures. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
America certainly has an abundance of food, even though many Americans do not. Yet, we face a momentous choice of whether to pursue a food future rooted in the ethic of sustainable agriculture or one based on the exploitative ethic of agri-industry. What better symbol of agri-industry's vision of food than that ubiquitous Thanksgiving bird, the butterball turkey? The butterball has been hoisted onto our tables by huge advertising budgets and regular promotion payments to supermarkets. The birds themselves have been grotesquely deformed by industrial geneticists who created breasts so ponderous that the turkeys can't walk, stand up, or even reproduce on their own, thus earning the nickname dead-end birds. Adding torture to this intentional deformity, the industry sentences these once majestic fowl to dismal lives in tiny confinement cages inside the sprawling steel and concrete animal factories that scar America's rural landscape, monuments to greed-based corporate husbandry. As the eminent farmer-poet-activist Wendell Berry tells us, eating is a profound political act. It lets you and me vote for the butterball industrial model or choose to go back to the future of agriculture, which is the art and science of cooperating with rather than trying to overwhelm nature. That cooperative ethic is the choice of the remarkable Good Food Uprising that has spread across the country in the past 30 years. Now, the fastest-growing segment of the food economy, it is creating the alternative model of a local, sustainable, small-scale, community-based, organic, humane, healthy, democratic, and tasty food system for all. This is Jim Hightower saying, to take part in the good food movement and find small-scale farmers, artisans, farmers markets, and other resources in your area, visit www.localharvest.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Across the country, in red states and blue, voters gave their support to progressive ballot measures. Melody Fields Figueredo says ballot measures speak powerfully to what matters to voters and are often the unsung heroes of the progressive movement. And we say hello to Melody Fields Figueredo, Executive Director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, or BISC. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about the ballot measure wins this year.
Absolutely. And it's, of course, our pleasure to have you with us. You know, in addition to Trump being voted out of the White House, whether he thinks so or not, this election will be noted for a number of progressive victories on the state ballot measures. One of the issues that was particularly successful was police reform. Give us an overview of how the issue fared nationwide and your sense of why voters voted in favor of police reform.
Absolutely. So 19 of the 20 local ballot measures addressing police brutality, from independent boards to investment into communities and divestment from police, they succeeded. And one of the reasons is because there has been a multi-year strategy led by the Movement for Black Lives to talk to people in their communities about what matters to them. We have been in the middle of a pandemic and also a racial reckoning in this country. And because of that, you have seen communities, and we've seen this across the country, these are the issues that matter to them. This is what is affecting their daily lives, and that's very real for Black and Brown folks. So that is absolutely one of the reasons why we've seen the success this year, because of the deep organizing by folks from the Black Lives Matter movement that have been talking to their communities, not just this year, but for the last several years. This is part of a growing movement. And when we can have the synergy between electoral politics and movement building, that's where we start to see real power being built.
A measure that is also getting a lot of attention is the $15 minimum wage that was approved by Florida, which, as you well know, is a conservative-leaning state. What's your takeaway from that victory?
My takeaway is something that we have actually seen over the last several election cycles. Progressive issues win when you put them in front of voters. Even when conservative candidates, they win. I mean, this happened in 2016 in Arizona. The same time that Arizona elected Donald Trump, they also passed minimum wage. We see that again in Florida. And my takeaway is the importance of taking these progressive issues, these issues that are actually going to transform people's lives in a year where we've had huge job loss, where we've seen, wage decreases. Of course, voters in Florida acted and decided to raise the minimum wage because they're feeling it in their pockets. They're feeling it in their families. So, we know, and we've seen this over the last several years, that these issues win when we put them before voters.
Something else that has steadily been increasing over the past few years, decriminalizing drugs, and it got a boost in several states. 4 states legalized recreational marijuana, and in Oregon, a measure passed that decriminalized personal possession of all illicit drugs. What's the big picture here? Are Americans just kind of tiring on that war on drugs?
Absolutely. And again, this is just yet another example of how important movement building and doing the deep organizing and narrative shifting, that's critical. That's how we move the needle. That's how we shift power. What I would like to see further is legalization is important, especially as we see the impact that really archaic drug policies have had in mass incarceration and over incarcerating Black and brown folks. But they also have to address what you said earlier, the actual decriminalizations and how these communities have been over policed when it comes to drug convictions. I mean, and it has disproportionately impacted Black, brown, and low income people who have higher sentencing than others on other issues. This is part of a growing in movement, and I think the step further also is the revenue generation around now having these dispensaries. Are we actually increasing Black wealth? Are we actually using these as revenue sources to increase funding for public education as well as affordable housing? These other issues that are really important to communities. It's not just about legalization and decriminalization. It's actually about how we're investing back into communities that have been hit the hardest by really, to be very frank, racist drug policies.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, as you were answering the question, and I started to think, I countless times you hear these stories of, and basically, if I, as a white person, were to walk down the street and I got busted with, say, whatever amount of marijuana,
For sure. Mm-hmm.
and a person of color walks down that same street, gets busted, has the exact same amount, that person goes to jail, I walk away.
Absolutely. And that is to a bigger conversation about the criminal legal system, or what I believe is the criminal punishment system. It is not about restorative justice. We need to take justice out of the way we talk about this. It's not about restoration. It's not about justice. It's actually just simply a punitive system that it has disproportionately impacted communities of color.
Yeah. We're speaking with Melody Fields, Executive Director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center here on the America's Democrats podcast. Chris, another notable theme was the elimination of racist symbols and language. Where did we see some progress on this issue?
We had so much progress this year. Nebraska in Nebraska and Utah, both of those states removed slavery as a form of punishment for a crime from their state constitution. Something, if I might add, is still in the United States Constitution. 13th Amendment, right? Ava DuVernay's movie that many of us saw, right? That led to mass incarceration in this country. Those are 2 states. In Alabama, they moved racist language. In Rhode Island, they removed the language around the name of the state itself as a Providence Plantation, right? And in Mississippi, They voted for a new flag that removes the racist Confederate symbol from the state flag. So we have seen, which I think is again part of this larger movement around fighting back on racism and anti-Blackness in this country. We're seeing where if we have real conversations with folks, this is not who they want to be. They don't want this to stand for their communities. And I think this shows real progress of when we take these issues before voters themselves and have the ability to have real conversations, that's how we change hearts and minds.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Taxes. That's more of a mixed bag here. What should we be paying attention to in terms of progressive wins and losses?
Well, I mean, when you've had an opposition for the last 40 years that have had a very anti-tax message, it's hard to beat back on that, right? But we did have really important wins in Arizona by increasing funding for public education. I mean, in Colorado, they voted against the Gallagher Amendment, which has been there for 40 years, and folks on the ground have been fighting that for so long. Like, those are really important wins. But part of the problem, especially when it comes to revenue, is we run the same play. And I think, to use a sports reference, right? If you are like using the same play over and over again and you haven't won that ring for the last several years, guess what? You're not going to win that ring, right? I think that means we have an opportunity to radically reimagine the way we do revenue and talk to voters about that and really shift the conversation. And this is going to be really important next year. State legislatures are dealing with budget deficits. They are facing budget shortfalls. If we do not have a different conversation around revenue and what taxes mean for folks, then many of the services that folks rely on, especially in the middle of a pandemic, when it means housing, healthcare, community-based services, those are all on the line next year. And we have to have a new strategy that BISC is very committed to working with our partners on how we generate revenue across the country.
And that actually also goes back to the our discussion about the legalization and decriminalization of marijuana. The legalization part 100%. Of it, especially when you've got these dispensaries, I mean, practically printing money in some of these states. So, yep. And then, but more importantly, putting it back into the community, as you pointed out as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. There are so many different revenue sources that we haven't even tapped into. And that's why we truly believe at BISC it requires radical reimagination, because if we keep doing things the same way, we're going to get the same results.
Right. And the sports analogy, I think, was perfect. Same play over and over again. Eventually, they're going to stop you.
Yeah.
Stepping back from the issues, let's talk about your organization. And how does your organization view the larger role of ballot initiatives in enhancing democracy and advancing progressive goals?
Ballot measures really, I think, are often the unsung or overlooked hero within the progressive movement and how you create a thriving democracy. I mean, ballot measures themselves are direct democracy. You are taking issues directly to voters, and they are making a decision on what they want for their lives and for their communities' lives. They play a critically important role in building a thriving democracy. They shouldn't be an adversarial role within what we want to do at a state legislature, on a local city council. If anything, it bolsters the efforts of state legislatures. You already know what your constituents want. They just said they did through these ballot measures, right? This is an opportunity for many of our elected officials to, create a more representative democracy. And what we know at BISC is voters of color, the rising American electorate, right? The electorate that delivered a huge progressive victory this year and taking power away from a fascist who has been undermining our democracy at every turn. We know that this is highly motivating for folks. These issues, whether it's raising the minimum wage, paid family leave, increasing revenue for education, voting rights for formerly incarcerated, they all won, and they motivate folks. So they are really critical to, I believe, shifting power and fundamentally finally delivering on the world that is equitable and just that we have not had yet.
And looking ahead, now with 2020 in the rearview mirror and on many levels, thank God, what will be the focus of your work at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center?
We are going to double down on community-based and grassroots organizations and supporting the leaders who have been organizing for decades, for years, folks like Arizona, like Lucha in Arizona, folks like the Florida New Majority in Florida, these grassroots community-based organizations that are in deep partnership and collaboration and know what is best for their communities, where they are already shifting power and giving them the skills and tools to take the issues that sometimes we don't see the people in our who we elect to office deliver on. We are going to double down because we know this is the future of our country. It's actually not the future, it's the present and the future of our country, and we are going to double down on building state-based power. That is how transformation has always happened in this country, and the time is not now to shift where we should be putting more resources into.
A lot of positive out of this most recent election. Your work, of course, has been a big part of that. We thank you for that. Melody Fields, Executive Director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Chris, thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back again soon and get an update maybe down the road.
Absolutely. Now we have to implement these ballot measures, right? That's the critical work moving forward. And we have to protect the process itself. We know voters want ballot measures. Well, they rejected every attempt this year to take away direct democracy. So there will be much more to report on as we go into the state legislative session.
Your fight is not over.
It never is.
Chris, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, a key member of President-elect Biden's economic team on why inequality is rising and why it has to be reversed.
Income inequality. Let me just ask you to start off, how bad is it? How real is it?
It's very real. And whether it's bad or not is a matter of your perspective. I do think it's extremely problematic in lots of ways. I think it's responsible for many of the problems we face today, all the way from slower macroeconomic growth than we'd like to see to political upheaval, which I'm sure we'll get into. I think just a few kind of baseline numbers to orient our listeners. We're back to levels of income and wealth and wage inequality that we haven't seen since the late 1920s. And people may remember that didn't end well.
The Gilded Age?
Yeah. In other words, so for example, back the share of income going to the top 1% peaked out at a bit north of 20% in the late 1920s, and that's where it is now. If you go back a few decades, back to say the 60s, the 70s, 10% of all national income was held by the top. Now it's doubled. It's 20%. If you talk about wealth, which is a lot more concentrated and, in my view, a lot more connected to many of the dysfunctions going on in our economy, political corruption, for example, same thing, a doubling, but in this case, a doubling from 20%, that is 20% of all wealth held by the top 1%, to 40% of all wealth. So you've got the top narrow group, they're controlling more wealth than the bottom half.
And is that why? What are the causes of that? How did it? And why does it just keep growing?
I don't think that there's a single cause. It is multi-determined. There's numerous perpetrators. Certainly one of them is the decline in worker bargaining power. And you can think of fewer unions as being linked to that, no question. We've had a decline in the private share of unionizations down to 6%. At its peak, it was 4 or 5 times that. We have, and with that has come, conversely, the rise of employer power. One of the things that economists talk about now is the concentration of firms within industry, so that some of the big firms, and people know who I'm doing, the Apples, the Intels, some of the hospital conglomerates. These firms now control enough of an industry. In retail, it's Amazon. These firms now control enough of their industries that they can set wages and labor standards. So they're kind of taking what used to be a government function, setting labor standards, pushing back on inequalities through those kinds of policies, taking that into their own private sector hands and maximizing their profitability, often at the expenses of their workforce. The financial sector has grown a great deal, while the manufacturing sector has shrunk. Part of that's globalization, which also has its fingerprints on this inequality problem. And the financial sector is a sector with tremendous inequalities embedded within it. Then I think you get to the interaction of all this concentrated wealth and income and power and politics, which in this country is more permeable. The barrier between concentrated wealth and political policy is more permeable than in than in any other advanced economy. So inequality, you asked, how does inequality beget more inequality? Because the wealthiest among us can buy not just the politicians they want, that's kind of an old story, but the policies they want. And so we see a tax policy, which is another cause of the problem. We see a tax policy under Trump, a guy who was elected through this whole faux populism kind of agenda. We see here a tax cut that exacerbates inequality by shifting even more income up to the top. So both the private distribution and the after-tax distribution are pushing in the same wrong direction.
I wanted to ask you something. You used a phrase earlier, because you hear income inequality, but there's also wealth inequality.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, they're not the same thing. So one way to think about it is income is a flow and wealth is a stock. So you get your income month in, month out, and some of us, if we're earn enough relative to our expenses, we can put some aside to save. And that's wealth. So wealth is our savings, but then when you get into the big leagues, up there in the top of the wealth scale, wealth is your assets. And so if you look at the wealth holdings of those in the top, even 10%, you're going to see very little earnings from paychecks. Paychecks mean very little to these folks. They mean everything to the median household, the household right in the middle of the scale. But it's all about assets. And if you look at asset appreciation, the extent to which, we talked about inequality begetting inequality, wealth begets wealth. I mean, it goes back to the old song by
Rich Get Richer, right?
Yeah. What's the old song about God Bless the Child by the famous jazz singer whose name I'm blocking? Billie Holiday, the old Billie Holiday song, them that's got shall get. That's actually a compounding formula. If you go back to your early economics training, the fact that if you have these, you start with a large base of wealth, and you've got our financial markets generating the kind of asset appreciation they do, especially relative to pretty stagnant earnings and incomes for families in the middle. That's why wealth has become so concentrated.
So building on the numbers that you mentioned a little earlier, I looked last night in 2017. On the site inequality.org. Last year, the top 10% had 9 times the income of the bottom 90%. The top 10%. The top 1% had 30 times the income of the bottom 90. The top 0.1%, 188 times the income of the bottom 9%. When most people see that, I mean, it's hopeless, right? I mean, they just feel
it's definitely
don't
not
have a chance.
They may feel that way, and I certainly understand being incredibly discouraged by these, especially as you said earlier that the numbers are going the wrong way; they're getting worse.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, especially for those of us who track these things historically, that these numbers have gone up and down, and there have been periods on our history when I mentioned earlier. There have been periods in our history where there was half as much inequality as there is today. Instead of the top 1% of wealth holders holding 40% of the wealth, they held 20%. Now, you might still argue that that's too high, and we're always going to have more inequality here than in most other advanced economies because of our approach to capitalism versus theirs. But I think people should be not discouraged, but truly incensed by the extent of the inequality you just ticked off.
I remember when you were chief economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, that President Obama at one point said that he thought that income inequality was the greatest challenge facing the country today.
Yeah, I was very proud of the president for setting it up that way. I just kind of a...
What did he do about it?
You know, you have to remember just how hamstrung he was. I mean, Congress decided from the get-go that they weren't going to do anything to help this president. And in fact, he made a lot of proposals that would have left us with more progressive taxation, with improved labor standards, with higher minimum wages. They were all blocked. He did try to, late in his tenure, try to change some of the labor standards that he could do by regulation and rule changes, particularly an overtime rule, so that middle-class workers could once again be eligible for more overtime that they should get. But that never went through. It hit a court challenge, and in fact, the Trumpies are pushing the other way on that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the unions. One proposal that I've seen, and in fact was in the recent New York Review of Books, is that the labor unions, their declining power, of course, has contributed, as you pointed out, right, to the inequality. But that they have maybe a weapon that they can use in the big labor pension funds. And the way they decide on what companies to invest in and what kind of policies. Is that part of a solution?
I think it is, and the labor folks certainly know all about that weapon. And I think that they've been fighting wars on so many different fronts, particularly as their membership has declined, and some of those pensions have been underfunded, so they've got headaches in that regard as well. But both the unions and other shareholders have engaged in some sort of proxy actions to try to get companies to behave in ways that are more helpful to average working folks. And they've had a little bit of success in that regard. And in fact, I think that is, to some degree, an untapped pressure point.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, we've talked about wealth inequality. Elizabeth Warren talks about and a difference between black and white wealth inequality.
That is a really critical difference. I mentioned earlier the median household, meaning the household right in the middle of the wage or income or wealth scale. So if you look at the median net worth, which is a good measure of wealth. That's your assets minus your liability. So you have to take debts into account because they're negative wealth. If you look at the net worth of the median, white household, it's something, but it's not much. I don't have the numbers in my head, but it's probably, in the tens of thousands, and it's largely home ownership. You don't have a lot of median households walking around with a stock and bond portfolio. But sure, home ownership is a key source of wealth for middle income whites. If you look at African Americans, median wealth it fluctuates around zero, and especially after the housing bust, it went negative. So yes, she's absolutely right to highlight that problem. And even if you'd be completely incorrect to think this, but even if you thought that we lived in a post-racist society, you'd be wrong. There's a lot of evidence every day how wrong you would be. At least on this issue, on the absence of wealth for black households, you have to acknowledge the legacy of slavery, because African Americans were never able to even begin to accumulate the kind of wealth that, as we said earlier, begats more wealth. There are network effects, neighborhood effects, education effects. Basically, where you start out in this country is way too indicative of where you end up, and that puts minorities and African Americans in particular at great disadvantage.
You did mention the tax cuts.
Yes.
First, the George W. Bush tax cuts, I guess, and compounded by the Donald Trump tax cuts, both exacerbating this problem and rewarding the people who are at the very top.
Yeah.
How big a factor?
It is a real factor. It's a secondary factor to the private sector dynamics that I described earlier. The ascent of finance, the decline of manufacturing, globalization, the loss of unionization, the diminished labor standards, the increase in the firm concentration. But all of that is pushing the private, or I should say, what economists call the primary distribution of income, meaning the distribution of income that happens from market actions or market outcomes. So the market does its thing, and there's a distribution of income and wealth, and then the government gets in there and it typically redistributes. And in fact, our tax system remains somewhat progressive, but there is much less of the kind of redistribution that pushes against inequality and more of the upward redistribution that exacerbates it. So while it's a secondary factor, you're right. The George W. Bush tax cuts and then later the Trump tax cuts have exacerbated this problem on many levels. I mean, yes, there is a huge cut in the corporate tax rate. So corporate profitability, which shows up in the stock market, the stock market is basically a metric of expectations around future corporate profits. The 80% of the value of the stock market is held by the top 10%. So if you're going to do something like cut corporate taxes, it's going to boost corporate profitability, that's going to raise the value of share prices, that's going to help the wealthy. So that's part of the that's part of the Trump tax cuts. But another part is one that really gets under my skin, especially with all of Trump's phony trade stuff where he kind of tries to pretend like he's helping working people. The Trump tax cuts significantly will exacerbate offshoring because they actually have something called a minimal rate for global companies, for multinationals, that can pay even less than the reduced corporate rate.
So encourage more people to
encourage more offshoring. And again, that's one of my causes that's one of the causes I ticked off around inequality. So that too will make it worse.
Let's flash forward to January 2021. Let's say there's, God willing, a new Democrat in the White House. You are head of the Council of Economic Advisors. What priority do you put on income inequality, and what would you propose to do about it?
It would be way up there at the top of the list. I mean, it might be number one. It's certainly the racial dynamics that we described earlier, the wealth inequality therein would be way up there. And what I would do about it, or what I would encourage my principals to do about it, would be to start with tax policy that would reverse everything we just said. And in fact, if you look at the tax ideas that you're starting to hear from the Democratic candidates, that they are exactly that, not just to roll back Trump tax cuts, but to try to help middle and lower income people with expanded tax credits, typically attached to work. Here at the Center on Budget, we talk a lot about refundable tax credits and how important they are. Well, there are great ideas from many of the candidates of ways to significantly expand those pro-work wage subsidies that would both lift a bunch of people out of poverty and push, I think, pretty hard against income inequality. But I also would have a kind of a trade agenda that put workers and not corporate interests at the heart of trade policy. Obviously, Trump has pretended to do that, but in fact, he's done the opposite. And that would involve, and interestingly, I will say that candidate Elizabeth Warren recently released a plan that does this sort of thing. I would have a very significant industrial policy push. My economist friends often chide this idea as picking winners, and we don't pick winners in this country. Fact is, we picked winners all the time. We do it through the tax code.
I was going to say, the tax cuts picked winners.
The tax cuts picked winners. I just described some a minute ago, offshoring multinationals. But the way we pick winners is which firm has the most connected lobbyist. That's a really dumb way to pick winners. And in fact, of course, it exacerbates inequality. What I would do is I would urge my principal to look around the next corner and try to figure out where the U.S. can grab global market share. And one of the great places to do so would be in the kinds of ideas in the Green New Deal. Somebody out there, some country out there is going to sell battery energy technology to the rest of the world, solar, grid, wind, and I'd like that to be us. I think that would create significant production jobs for middle and low wage workers, and that would help push back on inequality as well. One follow thing, this is not a simple. This is what I would advise the candidate. It's not a simple question. We have to get right to work, and I actually suspect the next president will do so, to really repair labor standards that have been so eroded. Raise the minimum wage, which now I understand. Just read something from the Economic Policy Institute. The federal minimum wage has been left untouched for the longest time on record. It's $7.25, which any listener knows is ridiculous. Now, many states have acted on their own, but many southern states have not. So the federal minimum wage is kind of like a southern minimum wage now. The overtime rule I mentioned, there's lots of misclassification of workers as self-employed when they're really W-2 employees. So there's a lot I would do in the labor standard space.
Before we take a little break, could this ever, do you have envisioned the day, you wonder sometimes why there's not more public reaction or outrage at this growing inequality gap? Could it ever lead to the point where people are in the streets? I mean, there's a revolution, government just breaks down?
It's funny you should
It has in the past, right?
Yes. And
other societies.
It's I'm an economist, not a sort of political scientist type, so I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I will tell you this, though. I recently was on a panel at a very classy conference with, people flew in on their jets to get there.
Davos?
Not me. Yeah, a Davos type thing, but it wasn't Davos. And I was on an inequality panel. I was sort of the token lefty. And this guy who was running the panel, who is, I think, worth about at least $1 billion, he's a hedge fund guy, was basically telling the audience, look, the pitchforks out there look like they're getting pretty sharp to me. And we, in so many words, we have to throw these folks a crumb. And I have to say the audience was very unresponsive. I think they viewed him as like a traitor to his cause. And he was saying, let's just give them a higher minimum wage so maybe they'll leave us alone. So I don't know that I understand enough about dialectics of history to really be able to answer your question effectively. But I do think that tension is there. And I certainly think that it's helped Bernie Sanders come in ascendancy. Mm-hmm. And there's even an argument that Donald Trump tapped that sentiment as well. Right. It's just his thing was blaming all these other people for your problems.
Bill Press with Jared Bernstein, who served as Biden's chief economist and economic advisor under the Obama administration. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Thomas Frank, Chris Melody Fields Figueredo, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.